Not long after I got saved, I was still struggling with the things that I was doing prior to being saved. And one of those things was that I drank, as I've mentioned in previous videos. And there was an occasion where I went out on a Saturday night with my friends and I got drunk. And I knew it was wrong, but I still struggled with saying no and I would indulge in that activity. Well, I guess I was feeling guilty, so I decided to go to church. Now, most likely I was probably very tired, probably was up all night, if not most of the night, but I managed to drag myself out of bed and go to church. Now, I was clean and I was presentable, but I probably still smelled like alcohol and I wasn't dressed in my Sunday best. I think I had on a sweatsuit of some kind, but like I said, I still looked presentable. I was clean and nice looking, just probably not appropriately dressed for the occasion. But what happened is that as I was entering the church, there was a lady who kind of acted as the greeter, at the front door. And when she saw me, instead of being joyful and happy to see me and asking how I was and saying it was good to see me, things of that nature, you know what she said to me? She said, "Where have you been?" Like I was like she was my mother and I missed curfew or something like that. And that just put me back a little bit. And I was like, what does she mean by this? What's up with this attitude? So, I'd like to think God gave me the response to her. And so after a short time and I gathered myself and thought what I was going to say, I just looked at her and said, God knew where I was. And I just walked on by and went into church. And so I bring this story up because I was reading through John chapter 9 when Jesus healed the blind man, and it got me to thinking about the motivation of people. Why would this lady say this to me? But if you read through John chapter 9, if you go through verses 1 through 12, and I'm not going to read all those verses, but it'll tell you about Jesus healing this blind man. You'll find out that, Jesus heals the blind man. And what people don't realize is the beliefs of the people at that time was that if you were born blind, it was a result of a divine judgment. Therefore, only the divine could set you free from that judgment. And so when Jesus healed this man, he was calling attention to the fact that he was divine. He was the Messiah. He was God in the flesh. He was the Son of God. And so in order to heal this man, Jesus spits on the ground, makes clay or mud, however you want to put it, and rubbed it on his eyes. And then the man went and washed and he could see. Well, when did Jesus do this? Well, he did this on a Sabbath day. And apparently that's a no-no to the religious of the time, the Jews at that time. So if we pick up in John chapter 9, verses 13 through 16, let's read there. It says, they brought him, who was formerly blind, to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also asked him again, how had he received his sight? He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So this made me ask the question, were the Pharisees glad to see the man had received his sight? Because in verse 13 it says they brought him who was formerly blind to the Pharisees. Well, the answer to that question is no. They were unconcerned with the fact that he could see. They questioned the man just like the people did in verse 10 when they had asked him, how were your eyes opened? And so the man explained to the Pharisees, he said again what had happened. In verse 15, he put clay on my eyes and I washed and I see. So he just told them straight up, Jesus gave me my sight by putting clay on my eyes and I went and told me to go wash and I did. And here I am, I can see. But they didn't care. What were they most concerned about? Well, if you look in verse 14, we're reminded, now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And so they were more concerned about Jesus healing the man on the Sabbath rather than the fact that who could heal a man who was born blind, regardless of what day he did it on. So in verse 16, what did they say? Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. And so you sit there and you think he's not from God, even though he just did a miracle that you say only God could do by healing a man who was born blind. So if a man who performs a miracle that has never been done and is thought to only be accomplished by God is not from God, who is he from? Well, to them, they thought he was from the devil. And we see that if we go back to Matthew chapter 12, verse 22 through 24, it says, Then one was brought to him who was demon possessed, blind and mute, and he healed him. So the blind and mute man both spoke and saw. And all the multitudes were amazed and said, could this be the son of David? Now when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. So here we see again, Jesus heals a man who is demon possessed, blind and mute. And again, although many people don't know this was another messianic miracle that he did. It's not something you will find in the Bible. It's just something they believed at the time. And what do they say? The devil made him do it. They don't want to acknowledge that this man could be the Messiah, could be the Son of God, or the Son of David, as they say here. God in the flesh. Oh, the devil made him do it. Because if they acknowledge this, then it challenges all their beliefs. And that's what you see when they show Jesus healing the man in John chapter 9. Oh, he's not from God. That's the first thing out there. He's not from God because he did it on Sabbath. So I guess if he did it on Friday, they would have believed in him. But he did it on Saturday, or whatever day this Sabbath was taking place on. Then obviously it must have been, it couldn't have been from God. And so would you say that the Pharisees were demonstrating love or pride? Well, to me, they were demonstrating pride. And what is pride? Well, my definition of pride is religious pride. And this is the sin that results from when you believe you are being obedient to the laws of God. That's what people become prideful, because they have, apparently in their own eyes, they've overcome sin, mastered their flesh, things of that nature. And so the Pharisees believed they were obedient to God because of this. And they deemed Jesus to be guilty of violating the Sabbath law. Therefore, who cares what he did or who he is? Since this challenges their beliefs, then he must be condemned. That's what it was. He must be the devil, because we don't want to change our minds or want to acknowledge that he could be of God. So he must obviously be a devil. We can't question the fact this guy can see now. We'll just shoot the messenger, if you will, or shoot Jesus who delivered the message. But if we go to Psalms chapter 10, verse 4, it says, in his pride, the wicked man does not seek him. In all his thoughts, there is no room for God. That's what we see here. There's no room for God because they're wicked in their heart. They don't want to trust the fact that the Messiah is in their presence. They want to basically destroy him and rob him of all credibility so they can ignore him. They can't explain away the fact that man can see. Well, we can just destroy Jesus instead. So another question arises. Does a preoccupation with observing the law, or any religious standard for that matter, produce love in a person's heart? Again, the answer is no, of course not. Of course it doesn't. It produces the exact opposite, actually. The focus becomes, what are you doing, instead of what is God doing through you? Are you loving God? It becomes, are you loving God, instead of are you being loved by God? It is about, are you overcoming sin, instead of are you trusting in the forgiveness of sins? Are you transforming your behavior, instead of are you renewing your mind? Are you becoming more spiritual, instead of are you learning how to love? It's all these physical aspects they're looking at, rather than what's happening to your heart. Because if your heart changes, your mind will change, or your behavior will change, but your behavior doesn't necessarily, it won't change your heart. And it reminds me of Galatians chapter 6, verse 13, where Paul wrote, for not even those who are circumcised keep the law, but they desire to have you circumcised, that they may boast in your flesh. People who aren't obeying the law, even though they think they are, they want to put you under the law so they can boast about what they got you to do. And that's what you see here. It's like, well, we want you to be obedient to the law because we believe we're obedient to the law, and this justifies our obedience to the law. That's what they want to do. But it has nothing to do with love. It's just get your flesh to behave, get your flesh in order, manage your flesh. And you don't even have to know God to do that. Nobody has to know God to obey the law. The Jews didn't know him back in the Old Testament. They didn't know God in the sense of knowing him as their savior and trusting him and obeying him, that kind of thing. He gave us the law, told us how to behave, and we'll go from there. We don't need him. We'll go from there. That's what it looks like. So from God's perspective, what is more important, observing the law or serving someone in love? That's what you have to think about when you look at all this. Well, it's obviously serving someone in love. The Pharisees didn't care about the man born blind receiving his eyesight. They didn't rejoice with him. They even put him and his parents on trial, if you will, asking again about how were you healed and who healed you and all that kind of stuff. They didn't care about who Jesus was. They only cared about him healing a man on the Sabbath. That's all it was. And I say all that because to go back to my circumstance in the church where the lady said, "Where have you been?" After I've been gone from church for a while. These people don't rejoice. They didn't rejoice that I returned to church. That lady didn't rejoice that I returned to church, just like the Pharisees didn't rejoice in the fact that this man had received his sight. This lady only wondered where I had been since I last attended church, just like the Pharisees are questioning this man and his parents, like, who did this to you? And how did he do it? Oh my God, he's not from God because he did it on the wrong day. He did it on the Sabbath. And that's why but you see in John 9:16, some asked, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? These are the people who were beginning to see Jesus for who he was, at least in my opinion. And that's why there were divisions. That's why the Bible says there was divisions among them, because people were like, well, hold up. Okay, well, he may have done it on the Sabbath, but he healed a man who was born blind. Ain't none of us doing that. Nobody else has done that. So who is this guy? That's what Jesus was trying to get him to pique their interest on that. And if we go to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 13 and 14, we see something else. It says, unlike Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the children of Israel could not look steadily at the end of what was passing away, but their minds were blinded. For until this day, the same veil remains unlifted in the reading of the Old Testament, because the veil is taken away in Christ. What is it saying? The law blinds you. The Pharisees had a veil over their eyes and could not see Jesus for who he was, because they were under the old covenant. They were under the veil of the old covenant, which had blinded them to what Jesus was clearly doing in their presence. And what this tells us is that they are so focused on their flesh, they could not see the spiritual things that were going on. Think about it this way. If you are walking and you always have your head down, looking where you're going, you don't see what's in front of you. And that is exactly what was going on when they're reading the law. They're so focused on themselves, so focused on what others are doing. They're not focused on the spiritual side of things. And in all this focus on the law, as obedient as they believe themselves to be, they couldn't see the forest for the trees. They missed Jesus. They missed God in the flesh right in front of them. I mean, he's healing people who are blind and mute, deaf, all the stuff that he did. And they did not care, because he wasn't doing it on the right day. He wasn't obeying the right laws, all these things. His flesh wasn't the way we said it should be. They were accusing him of sin, even though he was sinless. All this stuff is what it is. And they were just mean. They got people scared of them because they didn't want to get kicked out of synagogues. So people were not telling the truth. They were pushing away their answers and just trying to dodge them. That's how they are some of the meanest people in the world. And it reminds me of one of the wisest things I heard from a friend of mine who recently, about 10 years ago, passed away. He said, religion makes you mean as a hornet. Whether it's the Pharisees focusing on what a person does on the Sabbath, or the lady at the front door, the doorman at my church, wondering where I had been, it is the meanness, which is the fruit of the law and the religion they are bearing, not the fruit of the Spirit. That is where it comes from. They're just angry, stirs up sin in their lives, and they project it on the other people. The law blinds you to the real work of God and blinds you to his love. If they think that they're obedient to God, then they don't need God. They don't need to know God. They know his law, or at least they think they do. And so the law isn't changing their heart. It's stirring up sin. It's a curse. All these things the Bible tells us. And that's why people act the way they do. That's why people are so mean who are under the law. They just want you to behave. You care less what happens to your heart. Just behave. Sit your butt in that chair on Sunday. Tithe. Stop sinning. Just behave. That's all it is. They don't realize that when your hearts change, you're going to fellowship with people. You're going to give to a church you feel is promoting the truth. You're going to overcome sin because you're focusing on God and his love, not on yourself. That's what this is all about. And that's what you need to realize in the story of the blind man. take the veil off your eyes and see Jesus for who he is and receive his love. I hope this helped you. Have a good day.